A couple of weeks ago, Tamil film star C. Joseph Vijay led his newly formed Tamalaga Vetri Karagam to victory in Tamil Nadu, routing the much more established Dravida Munitra Karagam. But the appeal of the star politician is by no means limited to South India. Indian politics today is focused on carefully cultivated personas. Narendra Modi's brand is that of an ascetic strongman. Rahul Gandhi is a Mohammed marathoner. Mamta Banerjee is a cotton sari clad Didi. And Pinarayi Vijayan is a communist boss in a crisp white shirt. The received wisdom holds all of this to be evidence of democratic immaturity, a failure to vote for policy over personality. But the preference for this performing kind of ruler over the governing one isn't a pathology of today's democracy. It's an unacknowledged inheritance ingrained into our politics by politicians, great and small, for nearly 1,500 years. In the late 6th century CE, a dynasty formerly based on the Andhra coast called the Pallavas arrived with their armies in present-day Tamil Nadu. In this region, especially the Kaveri Delta, powerful peasants of the Vellala caste controlled most agricultural land, and they weren't interested in new kings handing out property to their loyalists. And so, the early 7th century king Mahendravarman I, who was a playwright, an aesthete, and a patron of rock-cut temples, invested in a new mode of semi-divine political branding. In his temple to Shiva at the Trichy rock fort, for example, he claimed that when he, and I quote, made a stone figure in the wonderful stone abode on top of the king of mountains, this ruler, Vidhi the creator, made Sthanu Shiva true to his name and became himself Sthanu together with him on earth, which is to say, fixed and immortal. Now, this kind of Sanskrit pun could not be read by the average subject or devotee. Mahendra's audience was other landed aristocrats over whom he claimed preeminence through his proximity to Shiva. What followed, as historian Manu Devadevan demonstrates in his paper From the Cult of Chivalry to the Cult of Personality, was a wholesale reinvention of Pallava royal identity. Temples were named after the king's personal titles, for example, Mahendra Vishnu Griha or Mahendra's home for Vishnu. Cities were renamed Mahamallapuram after King Mahamalla, the great wrestler. Pallava court poet Dandin, whose Kavya Darsha or Mirror of Poetry shaped literary practice from Sri Lanka to Tibet, made explicitly urban and elite recommendations for good Sanskrit, maintaining a distance from the rural and the rustic. The entire infrastructure of Pallava kingship was calibrated to dazzle an audience of urban literate elites. The 8th century Pallava king Narasimhavarman II left a catalogue of 233 personal titles inscribed at Kanchipuram, how modest of him, celebrating his courage in battle, his beauty, his erotic energy, and his generosity to Brahmins. Not one of them meant anything to the effect of the great king who built schools and hospitals. Now, this kind of political techniques, to be clear, were not unique to the Pallavas. As historian Ronald Inden argues in his book Imagining India, the paramount medieval sovereigns, the Rashtrakuta emperors of the Deccan, presented themselves as descendants of the moon, bringing order to the decadent Kali age. Their Prashastis catalogued military campaigns against recalcitrant kings and described their lustrous fame expressed in jewels, royal parasols, and captured insignia. The Rashtrakuta imperial formation was a hierarchy of ranked kings and lords bound to the Maharaja Dhiraja, the great king of kings, through the distribution of titles, honors, and symbolic privileges. The king's subjects were other aristocrats who were the only individuals with the resources to actually challenge him. Political energies were directed towards keeping these guys in line through architectural, literary, and occasionally military manifestations of power. Now, the Cholas gave the medieval royal persona its most durable and sophisticated form. Philologist Whitney Cox in Politics, Kingship and Poetry in Medieval South India studied the May Kirti, which is a Tamil verse eulogy which prefaces every Chola royal inscription from the reign of Rajaraja I onwards. Now, Professor Cox writes that this was directly adapted from Pallava and Rashtrakuta antecedents, but instead of embracing the florid literary quality of these Sanskrit Prashastis, the Chola May Kirti was composed into a simplified version of the old Akaval meter, the dominant measure of the Sangam poetic anthologies from the early century CE. Akaval was a conservative classicizing register evidently meant to appeal not to a group of avant-garde connoisseurs but to a wide Tamil-speaking literary elite, as Professor Cox puts it, namely the Velala gentry of the Kaveri floodplains. This was the social class from which the Chola military and bureaucratic leadership were drawn. So, Mekirtis, quite interestingly, have very little to say about the king's administrative prowess or his building tanks or his conducting public works. Instead, as Cox puts it, and I quote, the field of kingly action is made into a stage for a small cast of aristocratic heroes and villains, the martial celebrities of the time. End quote. The Chola king is depicted as a resplendent hero who effortlessly routs rivals of the Kalyana Chalukya, Pandya, and Chera clans. And unlike earlier royal eulogies, Chola Mekhitis don't appear only on the king's gifts and grants. Their martial charisma was pitched to a wide audience and it was absolutely irresistible. Everybody wanted to be a part of it. Over the next century or so, the Tamil gentry used royal Mekirtis as prefaces for their own temple gifts, and they would seek to obtain Chola court titles for themselves, such as Rajaraja Brahma Maharaja, which is to say Rajaraja's great Brahmin king, or Arayan Rajarajan, Rajaraja's little king. Even military groups would seek Chola-linked identities such as the Rajaraja Jananatha Therinja Parivaram, the select retinue of people's leader Rajaraja. The parallel to today's Indian youth groups and political cadres is kind of striking. Featured in hundreds of grand inscriptions across dozens of temples year after year, the Meykirti was effectively a medieval broadcast. It appeared in temples across the Coromandel coast, it was legible to a broad swathe of society, and presented the Chola court as the primary fount of honors for ambitious members of the landed peasantry. The king was a martial, masculine superstar, and the closer you were to him, the more important you were. The Turkic and Persianate rulers who entered India from the 11th century onwards carried a very different theory of kingship. Jihad against the infidel was profoundly valuable in their self presentation, but so too was submission to the authority of Sufi saints and the notion of providing justice to all subjects. In India in the Persianate age, Professor Richard Eaton cites the 12th century scholar Ibn Balkhi, who conceived the king's justice as the binding principle of the political world. To Balkhi, it was a quality of the ruler's person, explicitly detached from religious obligation. Effectively, though, that was still personality politics under a new name. The Persianate and Indic cults of royal persona fused quite quickly. By the 13th century, Delhi residents were already praising the Sultan Balban in Sanskrit Prashastis, mind you, as having subdued the rulers of the entire subcontinent, very much in the style of Rashtrakuta eulogies. Eaton also discusses the Sanskrit poet Udayaraja, who in the 15th century wrote a court epic portraying the Muslim Sultan Mahmud Begada of Gujarat as a Chakravartin, a universal emperor, a Kshatriya descended from the sun, his court blessed by Saraswati and Lakshmi. By the late 16th century, which was the end of the first Islamic millennium, the Mughal Emperor Akbar commissioned the Tarikh-e-Alfi, the history of 1000 years, to position himself as a millennial sovereign prophesied, whose authority derived from his remarkable personal qualities. From the time of his successor Jahangir, Mughal manuscript paintings include imagery derived from Hindu cosmic notions like sacred bulls, fish, and rishis. Very much in the tradition of earlier Indic kings, Mughal emperors made multiple grants to Brahmins just as they did to Sufi shrines. While these were elite cultural traditions, they seem to have landed on fertile ground in India. Many Mughal subjects, both Hindu and Muslim, saw the emperor as divine. Large crowds attended rituals such as the Jharoka Darshan when the emperor appeared on a balcony to the acclamation of his subjects. Ironically, the only serious Mughal attempt to substitute institutions for personality was made by the emperor Aurangzeb Alamgir. He commissioned the Fatwa-i-Alamgiri, a comprehensive legal compendium of Hanafi Sunni Islam, to govern the empire through the rule of law rather than the mediation of a sacred king. Eaton observes quite wittily that Aurangzeb was sawing off the branch on which he sat. Mughal subjects wanted distant divine kings, not all too corruptible bureaucrats and qazis. In fact, Aurangzeb himself saw the political utility in being considered divine. At one point, he calligraphed magical banners for his army to use in putting down a rebellion. Several sources attest that he was considered a living saint. People called him Alamgir, Zinda Pir, despite his much murkier memory today. Now, the Indian interpretation of sacred rulership, which was a medieval solution to a world of landed aristocrats and limited state capacities, proved to be one of the most enduring political traditions in the world. It was still alive and kicking in the 20th century when the Indian National Congress embraced the branding of Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi as an ascetic Mahatma whose spiritual authority sanctified the party's politics. In subsequent decades, while film stars turned politicians such as M.G. Ramachandran set the trend, perhaps the most successful example of this pipeline was the Telugu actor Nandamuri Taraka Rama Rao, or NTR. For over 3 decades, starting in 1949, NTR played Rama, Krishna, and Duryodhana with equal conviction for audiences across South India. When he entered politics in the 1980s, he seems to have instinctively understood what 14 centuries of political culture in the subcontinent had worked out before him. Professor S.V. Srinivas in Politics as Performance, a social history of Telugu cinema, examines how NTR's 1982-83 campaign translated the personality broadcast into the grammar of modern mass democracy. The star leaned heavily into the semi-divine imagery of Telugu Talli or Mother Telugu, accusing the Congress High Command of giving the Telugu state stepmotherly treatment. His stage presence was bombastic, his promises were grandiose, delivered from a cavalcade of cars and not limited to the realm of the possible. Favorable coverage from Inadu, which was a newspaper now turned media corporation, allowed NTR and the Telugu Desam party to brand themselves at a scale that would have bedazzled Rajaraja Chola. And it worked. NTR's version of theatrical politics and welfare, branded as the personal gift of the elected ruler, continues to thrive and evolve across India in 2026. His opponents had labeled him rather pithily as NT Drama Rao, but they named, without quite realizing it, what Indian rulership has always been about in some form. If you have questions or comments, we'd love to hear them. Follow us everywhere on social media. You can find me on Instagram at Buddha and on Twitter at Ekanesati. We'll see you next week.